Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Viola Davis, Michelle Rodriguez, and Elizabeth Debicki are widows masterminding a heist. A gang of thieves led by Liam Neeson's Harry Rawlings are killed in an explosion after stealing $2 million from Jamal Manning, played by Brian Tyree Henry, that Jamal was using to fund his campaign in a Chicago alderman election against Jack Mulligan, played by Colin Farrell. Jamal threatens Harry's widow, Veronica, played by Viola Davis, into repaying the money in 2 weeks or else, and when she finds Harry's notebook and plans for his next job, she recruits Michelle Rodriguez's Linda and Elizabeth Debicki's Alice, whose husbands worked with Harry, and later Cynthia Erivo's Belle to help her execute the job. Widows is based on the British miniseries of the same name that aired on ITV in 1983 and was written by crime writer Linda the Plant, and was very successful back in its day, even getting a sequel series. Both of them have been re-released and restored together on a new Blu-ray just in time for the new film. But one of those viewers was a very young Steve McQueen, and it obviously had a huge impact on him, and he of course grew up to be a very successful director, having the likes of Shame, Hunger, and the brutally powerful 12 Years a Slave, which he won an Oscar for. But he's always wanted to go back and redo Widows. Although, funnily enough, this isn't the first time that it's been remade for an American audience. There was another mini-series starring Mercedes Raoul and Brooke Shields that transplanted the location to Boston, but it wasn't nearly as critically successful. For this latest version, McQueen co-writes the script as well as directing, and he does so alongside Gillian Flynn, who wrote Gone Girl and adapted her own book to the screen in that case. So given the prestige of both the director and the writer, it makes sense that the cast is absolutely illustrious, featuring a row of some of the best actors working today. So given all the talent involved with this movie, it should be an absolute classic. But is it? Needless to say, Widows is about grief, and that's primarily explored through Viola Davis's character of Veronica. She's had this tremendous shock and loss dropped upon her, and then to make things worse, it threatens her life, and given that circumstance, she does what anyone would do if they lost someone they loved. She reflects. She looks back over all the time that they shared together, those conversations that they had, those little moments, good and bad, and over the course of a series of crucial flashbacks through the narrative, she and we both understand her relationship with Harry before the robbery that took his life. And that's a very Flynn-esque touch, I think. But there's a lot of scenes where Davis is literally reflecting because she's framed by McQueen against either windows that she's standing up against or mirrors, and there's definitely the sense that there's a surface of her life, that she's successful and wealthy, and really she's been left with nothing and put in this very desperate situation. And that's where the other widows come in, because they too, without their husbands, are left in very precarious positions. They've all lost a considerable amount. And on the face of it, these women don't really share anything in common. They all come from different backgrounds, except for the fact that their husbands work together, the pain that they all share, and the heist that they're about to pull off. And Davis, as the ringleader, she has waves of intense emotion, but for a lot of this, she has to be quite cold and calculating. She has to essentially become her husband, much like the other widows have to do. They both have to try and step into this world they barely even know about, and in doing so, learn to understand their relationships with their husbands and actually grow in confidence over the course of the movie. You can especially see this with Elizabeth Debicki's character of Alice. She starts out the movie as being this very abused person, both by her husband, played very briefly by John Bernthal, but also her mother, played by Jackie Weaver. And through the course of the film, she grows more and more assertive, and she shows that she can actually do things for herself. She is far more competent than she gives herself credit for, and I really found Debicki's performance to be utterly engaging. She really actually stole a lot of this movie for me. She is fantastic. Every time the movie cuts to her, I found her totally absorbing. But Widows has far more on its mind than simply the heist movie aspect. What McQueen has done is that he's moved the story to Chicago, which in recent years on film has become a symbol of the disparity in America and of its violence culture, which is very much explored in this movie. And the robbery takes place in the midst of this local political election where both the candidates are wildly corrupt in their own ways. On the one hand, you have Jamal Manning, played by Brian Tyree Henry, who is a local crime boss that is trying to use the election as a way of cleaning up his image and gaining power legitimately. And there is an early scene where he bursts into Veronica's apartment to threaten her, and Henry is fantastic in that scene. But most of the muscle is given to his brother, played by Daniel Kaluuya, who is sensational in this film. He only has a handful of scenes, but every time he's on screen, he is such a threatening presence. You know that violence is coming in virtually every scene that he appears, and he really is such a force in this film. It solidifies Kaluuya as one of the most exciting performers that we have presently today. And on the other hand, you have this political family, the Mulligans. They've held on to this position for generations, and the only reason this election's been called is because the eldest, Tom, played by Robert Duvall, recently had a heart attack, so he no longer has the health to keep that position. Thus his son Jack, played by Colin Farrell, has taken his place on the ballot sheet. And you can tell there's a very tense relationship between father and son, because Tom is bigoted and racist and unpleasant, and Jack absolutely abhors him and everything that he represents, but nevertheless has still absorbed some of those prejudices from his father. And it's very much about the kind of families that absorb and consolidate power for themselves with no real interest for the people they preside over. Jack has no real care for his largely black constituency. It's all about keeping that position, keeping that power and privilege that he has lived his entire life. There's one moment that is easily one of the most memorable shots of any film released this year. There's a scene where Jack is campaigning on the trail and he gets into his car to go back to his home/headquarters. And the way that McQueen stages this is that he puts his camera on the car's bonnet. And so we see the front of the car the entire time whilst it's driving. Whilst this is going on, Jack is having this really uncomfortable, racially charged questioning, and as it really starts to get more and more intense, we don't cut back there, we just keep focused on the car, and as it makes its journey, we notice the neighbourhood starts to change, that it moves from the poorer neighbourhood that he's been campaigning in to the more affluent one where he lives. And this is maybe only a couple of minutes of screen time, maybe 1 or 2 minutes car journey, just a couple of blocks, but it's very powerfully done. It shows just how close those things are together, the disparity of Chicago, of that setting, the very thin separations between the haves and the have-nots. It's really very, very effective. It really is a great moment and is a really fantastic example of McQueen telling a very evocative story through the use of his camera and his visuals. This movie has such an embarrassment of riches that it struggles to utilise all of it. Jackie Weaver has one major scene as Alice's abusive mother. John Bernthal was out of the film before the title even appears on screen. Lucas Haas has a prominent supporting role as Alice's escort client. Garrett Dillahunt plays Veronica's chauffeur. Kevin J. O'Connor is in a wheelchair. You've got Carrie Coon as a fellow widow who is wasted in a handful of scenes. And finally, you have Cynthia Erivo, who pops up in the second half of this film as a babysitter that joins the widows as part of their plan. Technically, she's making her debut here. She was more prominently in Bad Times at the El Royale, which was released first but shot after this movie. Either way, I think she makes a lot with her material. I think she's really going to be a star in the future. But this comes down to my problem with the movie. There's simply too much of everything, or at least to my taste anyway. I think that what McQueen and Flynn have done with their screenplay is that they've created this multi-stranded story that has such sprawl that it threatens to extend beyond the length of a feature film. I do wonder why they didn't make this another miniseries like the previous versions of this story, because it feels like it's very well suited to that kind of format. And in the early stages of this movie, it does start out fairly slow and fairly deliberately, which is understandable given how much that it needs to establish. But it never picked up momentum for me because there's so much to keep track of, and it's cutting between so many different characters that I actually found the movie to be a little bit bitty and erratic in terms of its structure. That's sort of the problem. I really do think that Widows has this kind of bizarre problem where they even needed to tighten this up to focus more on the thriller element of it, or to go even further and just expand upon it, give all these characters their due. You can tell they're trying to flesh out all of them, and even the ones that are just sort of sketched, they still seem so richly detailed that you almost wish that there was a bit more time spent on them. You come out of the movie wanting more, which is not a bad thing to be feeling, but speaking from my experience, I liked individual characters and scenes and subplots more than I did the film as a whole. It never came together for me in that way. Maybe a second viewing will help, but even so, I think that there's definitely material that I would have trimmed. There's stuff with Colin Farrell I think that is unnecessary and kind of slows the movie down in spots. The one thing that I think really didn't work for me is that there's a later plot movement which is actually taken from the original miniseries, but here it feels detached from the rest of the story. It doesn't really work. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, in my opinion. It adds a lot of questions that the movie has no interest in answering. Again, if they had more time, maybe it would feel a bit more natural with the story, but here it feels like something that's a little bit contrived, to say the least. Perhaps not really helping that assessment is that I increasingly got the sense as it progressed that McQueen wasn't really interested in the heist aspect, which is fine. He's using it as a vessel to tell another story. And we do get scenes of the widows making preparations for their mission. However, I do think the film doesn't really spend a lot of time on it. It's a shame because they're totally inexperienced and they're learning as they go along. They're improvising. Some of the best scenes in the movie come from that. But because we don't spend nearly enough time on it, the fact that they become so competent in such a short span of time, remember, it only takes place in 2 weeks, it does stretch credibility. Once the heist does roll around as well, it feels a bit anticlimactic in my opinion. We spend 2 hours quietly building up towards this, and then it's over with in the span of 10 minutes. It is briefly intense, and I'm not expecting this to suddenly become an Ocean's movie. That would be ridiculous. It wouldn't fit the tone at all. They've obviously tried to ground this, but they've probably done so to a fault, because really it's just a smash and grab break-in. It's not nearly as elaborate as it seemingly appeared when we were first introduced to the plan that Veronica found. And in general, I think the ending is a little bit underwhelming. It's clear that they were kind of rushing to try and tie up all the loose ends and give all these characters satisfactory closures and resolutions, and some things get discarded because of that. There's one major element of the movie that just gets offhandedly resolved, which I think very much proves that point, and I think it shows that the movie would have benefited from a tighter focus, even if ultimately that final shot does fit the movie very well. Widows is a very good film. It's not a great one, but there is plenty of greatness in it, especially because it has such a fantastic cast and so many terrific scenes and moments and individual compositions all throughout it. Yes, I was a little bit underwhelmed by the movie, but objectively speaking, it's still better than numerous other films out at this present moment, especially because it's a Steve McQueen film. He knows his craft. overstuffed, and you can see that all throughout this film, even though I don't think it entirely comes together for me. And yes, it isn't quite up to the level of something like 12 Years a Slave, which I think is an absolute masterpiece. Even so, this is an exceptionally well-made thriller, nay, crime drama. Really, if you adjust your expectations and expect the latter rather than the former, you'll probably know what to expect.
Widows has all the ingredients for a truly great film, with an exceptional cast and brilliant writer and director, and yet the individual components work better than the whole. Davis, Rodriguez, and especially Debicki are strong as the titular widows, using the heist as a way of resolving their grief and economic hardship, but McQueen is interested in more than simply a genre piece, and not so much in the mechanics of the job itself. The story is set in the midst of a local Chicago election, and while this imbues the film with a lot of socio-economic themes, it does feel like both McQueen and Flynn have overstuffed it, and that it perhaps should have remained a miniseries to allow all the competing storylines and characters room to fully breathe, despite strong, occasionally intense direction. The cast from top to bottom is excellent. Daniel Kaluuya is an especially threatening standout, but the rushed ending struggles to tie both the robbery and the politics together, and it is a weaker effort than McQueen's powerful 12 Years a Slave.
If you like this review, then you can join my crew over at Patreon, where you can see my reviews early, among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.